Okay, so welcome everybody to the Safeguarding Adults Forum, March 2022. And it's a real privilege to hand over for this section of the forum to Lorraine Currie, who's the professional lead for Shropshire Council on Mental Capacity Act. So without further ado, Lorraine, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Morning, everybody. I'm hoping I can navigate Zoom. I'm a Zoom novice. And I do work for Shropshire Council. I have hurriedly put my slides together and I haven't put the Shropshire Council logo on any of them. So I don't know who I'm apologising to, really, you or Shropshire Council, but hopefully you'll get the gist of what we're doing and we'll have an interesting time together. I wish I was here for the rest of the session, really, given that you're going to be looking at some case studies. Okay, so I was asked to kind of talk about and tie in self-neglect and mental capacity. So that's what I'm going to try and do. It's not an easy ask, but I'm going to do my best. So I think, why are we looking at mental capacity? And I think the importance there is that with mental capacity, you get to decide. So that deciding means how you live, the decisions you make, who you meet with, who you have contact with, a whole host of things about how we live our lives. So it's absolutely key, isn't it, that we do assess capacity, that we understand how to do that. And it often forms a way forward. With capacity, there are certain options open to us. Without capacity, there are other options open to us. So what I'm going to do initially is just kind of update people really on the right way and the right ordering of carrying out a mental capacity assessment, because bizarrely, from the beginning of time, somehow we managed to kind of get this a little bit wrong. So you'll all be with me, you'll all be familiar with capacity assessments that look something like this. So we've all used this language, we've all set out our capacity assessments in this way, where we've described it as a two-stage test. Stage 1 being the diagnostic element, stage 2 being the functional element, or some kind of similar wording along those lines. And then later on, we found out that we needed to focus also on causation. In other words, did the person's diagnosis, was that the reason why they couldn't make the decision? So many of you may still have capacity assessments like this. And if you do, I'm going to explain why they need to be changed. So I'm kind of killing two birds with one stone, if that's the right expression to use. So we all had this type of capacity assessment, something that gave the diagnosis, then the functional element, which was the understand, retain, use and weigh and communicate. And then later we added a causation question. Now it's interesting to think, why did we do that? The Code of Practice for the Mental Capacity Act had it in that order. But I want you to just look at what the Act says. So the Mental Capacity Act says, for the purposes of this Act, a person lacks capacity in relation to a matter if at the material time they're unable to make a decision for themselves in relation to the matter because of an impairment of or a disturbance in the function of the mind or brain. That's the definition. And many of us have trained on MCA and we've given that definition, and then we've equally talked through the steps beginning with diagnosis and then functioning. So what do you notice in that definition that we've got in the Act? Well, what you notice is that the inability to make the decision comes first in the sentence, and then reference to the mental impairment comes second. In other words, we somehow, based on the Code of Practice, swapped the order round. We looked at the mental impairment and then their functional ability to make a decision. But the Act says you look at their inability to make a decision first, and then you look at the mental impairment. You might think it's just language and it's words and what she's waffling on about now, but it has become very, very important. The order is important, and I think particularly with the kind of circumstances that we're going to go on to talk about. And the order is important because the MCA itself says that a lack of capacity cannot be established merely by reference to a person's age or appearance or their condition or any aspect of their behaviour which might lead others to make unjustified assumptions about their capacity. So hopefully you can sort of see where we're starting to go, really, that the MCA says you don't make your decision based on what the person's disability, mental impairment, how they're behaving, and so on. So if we begin with a functional test, i.e. can the person make their own decision, then it's much better for us to practice supported decision making. If we're starting with the decision and looking at whether the person can make it, then that's a great opportunity for us to make sure that they get all the support they need to make that decision. We can target that support appropriately to help them understand if that's where they need support, or to help them with using and weighing the options or the choices. And we can also build relationships which might help us to work with people to address some of the areas of life that they and we find challenging. So by starting with this functional decision, we can start to build relationships, and particularly when we're talking about some of the thorny issues like hoarding or self-neglect, this relationship building is very important. So an assessment of capacity now can be described as best to be carried out by asking 3 questions. Now, I've already pointed out that the MCA Code of Practice has got this test the wrong way around, and we've all followed suit, but it's been pointed out through various cases, and most recently by a JB case in the Supreme Court. The case was about capacity to consent to sex, and it's the first time that capacity has been looked at in the Supreme Court, which is astounding, really, given how long it's been around. And the JB case confirmed that the right ordering of a capacity assessment is this order. So some of you or all of you may know that the Mental Capacity Act code has been revised, and the draft code is out for consultation. And the draft code will have the order the right way around. So the way to assess capacity, there's nothing different about the law or what we do or what we're looking for. It's about the order in which we approach it. So the first question to ask is the person able to make the specific decision? So that's what we might call the functional test. If not, do they have an impairment or disturbance in the function of the mind or brain? And if they do, is this impairment the reason that they can't make the decision? Okay. Functional question first, question about impairment, and then a sort of squaring of the circle, if that's the right expression. So one thing that I would kind of encourage you to do is to have a look at your mental capacity paperwork and where you can think about making changes to put them in the right order if they're not already. Now, 2 mistakes that people make with mental capacity, and particularly in the area of self-neglect, is either over-assessing or over-assuming. I think this happens in general. Either we say everybody needs to have a mental capacity assessment, sort of regardless of whether we've got any concerns about their decision-making, or we say, oh, we assume capacity. And yes, we do. That's what the Act tells us to do. But we can use that, or it can be used as a bit of an excuse. Well, there's no reason to doubt their capacity. We're just assuming. And I think either and both really pose some challenges, and we need to get that balance right. And this is a really sort of nice quote about this presumption of capacity, which says that the presumption of capacity is important because it ensures proper respect for personal autonomy. Yet the presumption, like any other, has logical limits. When there is good reason for cause for concern, where there is legitimate doubt as to capacity to make the relevant decision, the presumption cannot be used to avoid taking responsibility for assessing and determining capacity. because to do that would be to fail to respect personal autonomy in a different way. Okay, so it's quite right that we respect autonomy and decision making, but where there is genuine cause for concern, then we must assess capacity, and we mustn't use this assumption as a sort of way of getting out of it, if you like. So when we're assessing capacity, we start at the beginning. Easy to say, I know. So the starting point for any assessment of capacity is making sure that you clearly know what the issue or decision is. What is it that we're concerned about? What's the question to be answered? What's the decision the person needs to make? Then we need to work out what the salient points are that someone, anyone, would need to understand to make this decision. So to make this decision, somebody would need to know this, 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 and this. And then let's write that down. Let's put that in our assessment. To make this decision, they would need to understand this, 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 and this, and we'll put that down in the capacity assessment. Then we can work out, okay, if that's what they need to understand, how am I going to give them that information? And how am I going to give it them in a way that is relevant and meaningful to them? So it's a kind of straightforward, linear process. What's the decision? How can I identify the information the person needs and give it to them? How do I know if it's been retained and understood? And then importantly, how do I know if the person can use or weigh it? So understand, we need to test their understanding, because this is the functional bit of the mental capacity assessment. And they don't need to understand every element of what's being explained to them. They just need to understand the salient points. And you need to record that and then record the information that you've given and the options and the questions and answers. So it all starts with this kind of what's the important information for this decision. And then, as you know, the person needs to be able to hold on to that information just for enough time to make their decision. So there's no sort of prize for remembering things. It's not really about memory. It's about retaining. I just got to hold on to this long enough to do something with it and make that decision. And if the person can retain it long enough to make the decision at the material time, then that's what we're looking for. And then the person has to be able to use or weigh the information. And this is something that we're going to focus a bit more on. So this has been described as actually being able to kind of get involved in the decision-making process, to look at the various parts of the argument and how they relate to one another. And importantly for us, the person needs to understand the reasonably foreseeable consequences of reaching a decision, or in fact of failing to reach a decision. And this involves some weighing of those people who can talk the talk but not walk the walk. And there's quite a few sort of little ways that people describe this. Can someone use the information but disregard it, or can they not use it? You know, you may give them very valid reasons why their home needs to be cleared or tidied, or various other actions that need to be taken in relation to the property. And they may either choose to just disregard that, or they may not be able to use the information that you give them. It involves looking a bit more here, I think, about the person's values and their life story. Is this behaviour that you're concerned about new? Is it something that's always been a part of their life? It involves a wider conversation, and it also involves acknowledging that they might not value what you value, and vice versa. And then we know that they have to be able to communicate their decision by any means. So that's our functional assessment. And then we have to tie this thing all round by saying, okay, if the person has a mental impairment, let's say they have dementia, is their inability to make the decision because of the dementia? Is their inability to make the decision because of their brain injury or their learning disability? And we need to evidence that in our capacity assessment. So is it any different? What are the particular challenges when we're looking at assessments around mental capacity and self-neglect? I think it sounds like Duncan is going to go through what is self-neglect, and this is not my area of expertise, but just to give you a few edited highlights, I suppose. Self-neglect is a lack of self-care to the extent that it threatens the person's personal health and safety. It might be not managing personal hygiene. It might be not caring for surroundings, and that can include hoarding behaviour. It might be an inability to avoid harm as a result of self-neglect. It might include not seeking help or accessing services to meet health and care needs, or an inability or an unwillingness to manage or deal with the person's personal affairs. So I'm going to try and give some top tips. To be honest, they're mainly tips that relate to any of the complex and challenging areas that we have when we're considering mental capacity. But I think for self-neglect, getting the question right is particularly important. If you don't know what the decision is, then your capacity assessment will fall apart from there. If you don't know what the issue is, you can't be certain they've had the relevant information. And the challenge for us is, what is the relevant information in terms of self-neglect? What are we actually concerned about? Is it about the person's care needs? In which case it might be capacity to understand their care needs or accept a care package, or it might be more around capacity to keep their property as it should be kept, or it might be capacity to consent to the actions that need to be taken in relation to the property. So think for self-neglect, is it care? Is it accommodation? Is it both? This is the work we do beforehand. And if it's care, then we know that the relevant information, as the work on this has already been done for us. It means that we're looking at the areas where the person needs support, the kind of support they need, who's going to provide that support, what will happen without it, or if the person refuses it, and then that carers might not always treat a person properly and they need to know how to complain if they're not happy. So if it's care, that's the kind of area we need to be looking at. They're the kind of questions we need to ask. If it's accommodation or hygiene and accommodation, we'd need to equally work out our sort of set of information and then how to share that with the person. And I think what we start to find is that particularly executive impairment is often an issue in self-neglect or hoarding cases. And there's a quote there from a case which says, explains executive impairment as the ability to think, act and solve problems, including the functions of the brain which help us learn new information, remember and retrieve the information we've learned in the past, and use this information to solve problems of everyday life. An executive impairment in a person can mean that they show some or all of these signs, unable to translate their intention into action, full of promises and plausible, or on the other hand, apathetic, an inability to initiate, plan and sequence activities, struggling with new situations, better with familiar. Their behaviour might be aimless, impulsive and fragmented, or they might not be able to monitor and evaluate their own actions. Well, we did agree you were going to do this. We talked about it last week. Have you been able to do that? No. Do you know why you weren't able to do that? What was getting in the way? An inability to think flexibly or abstractly, less able to adapt to change, very sort of black and white, what we might call concrete thinking style, or a lack of a filter in social situations. And it's important that we look at some of the ways that executive impairment might present itself, because some of the causes of self-neglect might take us into that area. So it might be a brain injury, dementia, or other mental disorder. obsessive compulsive disorder or hoarding disorder. It could equally be a physical illness which impacts on their ability to do the things that they would do, and impacts on their energy, attention, organisation. Reduced motivation could be a side effect of medication, addiction. It could arise from domestic or other forms of abuse, traumatic experiences, bereavement, or just a life change. I used to be able to do this, I can't do it anymore, you know, that sort of reduction in physical ability. So there are lots of reasons, and the Mental Capacity Act is not available to us for every reason, physical illness, for example. So if we're aware of these executive impairment signs, then it might help us when if we're recognizing those. Scary dog noise, I think it was. If we recognize executive impairment, if we recognize that the person may have problems with problem solving or remembering and retrieving information, then it might impact on how we carry out that capacity assessment and how we support a person in general. Sorry, I keep looking at my watch because I haven't presented this in the same way, so I need to make sure that I'm on time. So when executive function's impaired, it can have all of these kind of impacts on that capacity assessment. It might reduce their problem solving, impact on planning, lack of flexibility in thinking. And I'm sure we've all experienced this. I can remember working indoors with a woman who whose property showed that she was self-neglecting. Her care of herself was very, very poor. She was a phenomenally intelligent woman. She had a number of degrees. She was currently doing another degree in her late 80s or even 90s. But for this one area of her life around keeping the property hygienic and herself hygienic, she just could not take on board that information at all. And she had a fixed response, which was 15 minutes with a steam cleaner and everything will be fine. You know, and no matter which question you put to her, she was very intelligent. So she had an answer. You know, why are there mice living in your chair? Because the GP left the door open and he let them in. You know, she had very, very good answers, but they showed signs of impaired executive functioning. The same, people might call it frontal lobe paradox, where somebody, sounds very grand, but it's actually, we all will have encountered it, where somebody is actually able to understand and reason through things, but can't put them into action when they need to be put into action. You know, sometimes we see a sort of, this woman that I've just described was an example of that. Very, very intelligent. She could understand lots of information, but simply could not execute it when it needed to be carried out. So it's problems with this understanding, problem solving, and acting on something at the time it needs to be done. So this kind of impairment can mean that somebody presents really well in a capacity assessment. They might mask their deficits. They might not necessarily be aware they're doing that. There might be signs that they struggle in day-to-day life, and that's totally at odds with what they're telling you. So they might give a perfectly logical reason for the state of neglect and how to deal with it, but they're unable to put those intentions into practice. So you might say people might be good in theory, but poor in practice. So sometimes it's not a challenge with understanding. The problem is knowing, but not doing in the moment. So they may know, you might have some very positive conversations, appears like everybody's agreeing, but actually they're not able to do in the moment. Sometimes the problem is knowing what answers are right. So people might have kind of learned over time or think, oh, well, that sounds like the right thing to say, but they're not able to apply them. And assessors then, in carrying out a capacity assessment, has to work out this very difficult tension between, is it an unwise decision or is it an incapacitous decision? And that's why these capacity assessments are often very challenging. The ability to use and weigh is crucial. There's a great difference between the person who gives you their view, tells you what their opinion is. It's different than the professional's view. Actually, it might even be the wrong view, but they're fully aware of the risks that are involved. So they are able to use and weigh the information. If I don't do this, that will happen. I know that, but this is what I'm choosing and why. That's different than the person who gives you initially those great answers, but in the situation is not able to apply anything that they've described. So sometimes for these reasons, I mean, maybe you could say every time, we need to triangulate the evidence that we're getting in a capacity assessment. And I like this. I'm trying to make it rhyme a little bit better, but it's what was said, what was read, what was seen. That's the sort of way of thinking about it. So our first port of call, of course, is always talking to the person. We're doing a mental capacity assessment. We're speaking to the person. They're central to this. We're listening to them. We're hearing what they have said. But we are also making sure that we are reading evidence. So we've heard them, we've carried out a capacity assessment, it's really very plausible. There's a lot of excellent conversation and intention to, yes, I understand that's a problem. It only got like that because of such a thing. And yes, I'm going to deal with it. I've got a plan this week and so on. But then you might read historical evidence, evidence in care plans or from other professionals that describes something very different. And then what I've called seen, it's kind of seen and heard. I wanted to make them all rhyme, but I couldn't. Maybe I'll work on it a bit longer. Then the third element of this triangle is speaking with those people who know the person, who you can say, well, she's told me she does this. Is that your experience? Or it's observing the person in action. And if you're working with somebody, particularly around self-neglect, then you will be going back, you'll be visiting them, you'll be able to balance this is what they said, but actually they've not done it. So it's about making sure that this evidence that you gathered is triangulated in this way. You might call it, someone else calls it a 3D assessment. You can call it whatever you like, to be honest. But it's what was said, what was read, what was seen, and balancing all of those to arrive at a mental capacity assessment that shows us the best way forward, really. An example, just a little example of this was in a Dole's assessment, but it carries through to lots of other situations. I asked Mr. Smith if he was able to have a wash by himself, and he said he could, indicating the sink in the corner of his room. I asked if he had a routine, and he said that every morning and night he had a wash. He explained that at home he had a wash basin upstairs. I asked if he could get upstairs, and he said yes, pointing out that he uses the stairs at the care home. Now, if you'd ended there, that would seem like a very reasonable conversation. But in conversation with care home staff, the assessor then wrote, I understand that Mr. Smith uses the lift at the care home and he was not able to get upstairs when he lives at home. Okay, so we're triangulating. You might also have said that assessor might have chosen to maybe just observe Mr. Smith moving around the care home and maybe ask that the care staff kept a note as he had a washing, in the sink as he's described and so on. It's also important when we're thinking about capacity, not only for self-neglect, but for anything, that it's not something that we can only assess once. This is a really crucial message. It's not kind of one strike and you're out. People can learn, develop and change. And that is true of anybody that we encounter and anybody that we work with. If we're working in a sort of partnership way and we're working with people, we can put in systems and structures and plans that help them overcome some of the obstacles they have in their life. Or information might appear which was not previously present, which suggests a mismatch between saying and doing. So you might find, and I've certainly encountered this, where somebody will say, oh, there's no reason to doubt their capacity. You know, the conversation with them was great, everything in the garden's rosy, but actually maybe a month on, maybe 6 months on, the situation has actually really deteriorated. And there's now a much clearer sort of mismatch between what the person says and what the person does. And also short-term decisions can be made and revisited. So we might say, well, right now, Mrs. Such and Such definitely lacks capacity around understanding her care and support needs because of, you know, she has been self-neglecting. But actually, let's do some work with Mrs. So-and-so, and then let's look at it again. You know, it's not something that once you've had a capacity assessment, tick, that's it, you've had it, it's over. You know, these are things that we should be revisiting all the time. And we can make a short, we can say, well, this is for now, but let's do a period of work with somebody, let's revisit it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. And then looking at what a good assessment looks like. And a judge has helpfully described capacity assessments which most protect rights as being criteria focused, evidence-based, person-centred and non-judgmental. I really wanted to try and make those letters spell something, and I'm still working on that. Maybe I'm just telling you more about how my brain works than anything else. Criteria focused, what is the issue or decision? Let's get that very clearly right. Evidence-based, where are you collecting your evidence and is it triangulated? Person-centered, this is a real human being, this is their life, that they have got a right to live in their way, balancing those sort of risks and benefits, autonomy and protection, but it must be based on their circumstances, their values, their life. And so we have to be non-judgmental, and that's particularly pertinent, isn't it, for self-neglect, because we might be sort of quite shocked, or things that might offend our sensibilities might not impact on another person, and there's no sort of right or wrong, is there? So it's important not to be judgmental. It's also, I would say, this is perhaps the most important slide in a way, which is don't fail to assess. So I started off saying it's important that we get that balance between assessing and assuming, right? Someone who hoards or self-neglects can take huge risks with their own health, and yet we find times where they've been assessed as having capacity because they can give this appearance of being very competent. Or they're deemed not to meet the criteria for a capacity assessment. And I've seen this again, time and time again. Oh, it's just an unwise decision. It's a lifestyle choice. You know, now that might be true, but how do you know? And are you prepared to take the risks that are involved in just sort of assigning something as an unwise decision without a proper capacity assessment? Decisions not being broken down into specific decisions but grouped together can be too complex, so that the assessment and the relevant information for that decision becomes too complex, and it's kind of not really going anywhere as an assessment. So there might be several decisions. There might be decisions about care and support. There might be decisions about accommodation and allowing cleaners, or having systems, or agreeing to somebody coming in to do a deep clean, various things. There might be several decisions, and therefore there might be several capacity assessments. And I know nobody ever likes to hear that, but they may need to be separated out and broken down into much more simple decisions. And in relation to hoarding and self-neglect, and I'm sure that this is what you'll be talking about later, developing a good rapport and early interventions critical. And the assessor has to balance the tensions between this respect for autonomy and respect for the person's well-being, balancing those, the risks and benefits of intervening, and the person's autonomy and protection. And this is the tension that we're holding together the whole time. Because if we assess a person as lacking capacity, then we are able to intervene in their best interests. It's still not always easy to do, because we're still working with human beings. But we know that at the end of that road, we have the court of protection as an option. Whereas if they have capacity, we don't have the same options available to us, although we do have the option of the inherent jurisdiction of the High Court, but that's probably a talk for another day. And on that basis, I think I've reached the point of questions. According to my clock, I'm even 3 minutes early. So I think Karen's probably going to stop recording before we go into questions, and I'll stop sharing.
Hi, Lorraine. Yes, I am going to stop recording now. That's brilliant. Thank you. And some really sort of key points to take away. And I think you've ended with a really useful one there. Don't fail to assess, and that kind of discussion about unwise decisions, etc. That was fantastic. And I'm sure that when we stop now for questions, there are going to be many of them. So thank you, Lorraine from Shropshire Council.
Yeah, thanks.